Thanks, Patrick, for the invitation and for organizing this event, and thanks the sponsors of the event. When Patrick read the list of sponsors, I was thinking of the many times I've beaten the path to some other department to get $200 here and $150 there to put together an event. I have a lot of respect for the work that you put in to do this. And it's a rare privilege, actually, to talk about a thinker who's been so important for me in the presence of the thinker. And actually, I thought for 2 minutes about the question of address and almost thought about the Michel Buteau address solution, which would have been impossible. And then Suzanne told me I only have an imagined Jacques Rancière, so that didn't work at all. We all have one. So anyway, so when I was writing my text for Patrick Braid's edited volume on Jacques Rancière's work, I whistled right past the title of the work I was considering, The Lost Thread, without sufficient attention, on the model of whistling past a graveyard, I guess. For someone working on French literature, as I often do, I should have slowed down at least long enough to signal that the title derives from the French expression perdre le fil, to lose the train of one's thought, literally to lose the thread, the organizing theme. Of course, we say the same thing in English as the translation of that work indicates. There's an interesting variation in French on this expression, and that's le fil rouge, literally a red thread, also denoting the main theme or common thread of an argument. One of the earliest literary mentions of the red thread, the fil rouge, appears in Goethe's Elective Affinities, and I quote, "We have heard about one particular custom of the British Navy. All the rope used by the Royal Fleet, from the thickest to the thinnest, is twined in such a way that a red thread runs through all of them. It is impossible to remove the thread without undoing the rope." And that means that even the smallest pieces of rope can be identified as a property of the crown. End of quote. The double nature of the fil rouge cannot fail to fascinate here. It marks the rope as a property of the crown, but it is also an essential strand of the rope, such that to remove it causes the rope to fray and become untwined. How to describe the technology behind this property marker, which serves simultaneously as a binder, I'm afraid I'll have to leave for another day and actually a little more research. It's a fascinating topic. But my reflections today will take the notion of the thread as a point of departure. I want to suggest that the argument in Jacques Rancière's The Lost Thread could potentially be restated by saying that the philosopher reveals the thread envisaged as a set of practices, what the French might also call les grosses ficelles, essentially essential binders, one might say, which have marked Western European literary representation since Aristotle and invariably hold together the elements of classical narrative. To put it succinctly, and Jacques Rancière himself summarized this point yesterday at the beginning of his talk, Aristotle proposed that literary representation should portray the acts of characters whose speech corresponds to effective interventions in the public forum in an ordered hierarchical society. Only those with the power to speak and to intervene can be considered the proper subjects of literary representation, and only their language, as it is translated into acts, can structure mimesis. In Rancière's view, then, if indeed that organizing thread, the fil rouge, is removed, as was progressively the case in the transition to Romanticism after the French Revolution, its absence unbinds classical literary structures, plunging the reading audience into a quandary. How to read these new sorts of frayed and increasingly untwined literary texts in which crucial parts of the Aristotelian scaffolding are missing. Rancière describes how critics reacted to Flaubert's novels, accusing the novelist of losing himself in descriptive details to the detriment of the thread of the story told about his characters. They wondered, to put it simply, why he had not concentrated more on what I want to call the plots of his novels. Taking my cue from Tim Ingall's wonderful essay on the history of lines, I'll point out straight away that the literary definition of the term plot derives from another meaning, namely a piece of land demarcated by lines laid out on the ground to measure it. Traditionally, this would mean lengths of string or rope stretched from stake to stake along the outlines of the section of land to be added to a repertory of property listings in an agrarian society where land ownership was a key component of social and economic life. Geometers plot the boundaries of a plot by fixing lines that define it and by measuring them very carefully. More broadly then, to plot a course then comes to mean to draw lines from point to point to guide a traveler toward a destination. When Flaubert's contemporaries criticized his writing for meandering among the details, they literally meant that they could not find their way through his novels. They could not identify the points that anchored the plot lines of those novels. So if you'll permit me a nod toward Patrick Bray's work, I would be tempted to say that the Aristotelian fil rouge, the red thread, the identifying thread of literary representations that hew to classical structures, can be seen as lines on a reading map. They allow readers to plot a course that transports them through a certain number of events or moments toward an ending that cannot really surprise them, because the variations on possible types of fateful destinations have been mapped out in advance in the course of a long tradition. So what happens when that thread, the fil rouge, the grosse ficelle, is no longer clearly visible to plot a course for the voyage of reading? What happens when the act of reading is no longer metaphorically superimposed on the model of a traveler following a path drawn on a map leading to a destination? Well, confusion, as Rancière suggests. Is the end of Madame Bovary informing us that Homais has been awarded a governmental Medal of Honor, a credible destination for any series of effective actions that lead toward it? I think not. Or what about the ending of the second Éducation sentimentale, sentimental education, when Frédéric and Deslauriers recall their youthful visit to a brothel, nostalgically opining that it was the best moment of their lives, meaning that the whole plot up to that ending is no plot at all, rather circular meandering that can only return to a beginning, which is really the beginning of nothing, right? At the risk of loosening a bit the suggestive argument Tim Ingold develops about lines and their history, I would submit that Flaubertian writing demands that readers no longer be travelers moving from point to point on the surface of a story plot along a mapped itinerary. Instead, they must become wayfarers in the Ingoldian sense. They must accept the fact that they cannot simply travel through a plot toward the destination. Rather, dwelling in the space of the narrative becomes the essence of the experience. One must understand literary space not simply as something through which one passes, but as a potentially endless constellation of moments and events along a now much more meandering line or thread, which slows the reader and diverts his or her attention away from the end, ultimately undoing the notion of destination entirely. Every moment is a destination. The narrative thread thus becomes a meshwork of crisscrossing threads. It's no longer a network in which the points are the central elements, joined together by lines. Rather, the meandering lines form a meshwork, and the lines themselves take precedence over the points. They are where the wayfaring reader dwells, or must dwell. Well before The Lost Thread, already in the 1998 Flesh of Words, Rancière had described emerging Romantic poetry in terms of movement, in particular of walking, the experience of human movement that most connects the individual to the practice of dwelling. One may set out on a walk with a destination in mind, but all manner of encounters intervene along the way. Asperities of the terrain, stray animals, trees and plants, other walkers, such that the true experience of walking is the realization that these unpredictable encounters are the defining elements of the exercise. I'm reminded here of an American friend who has taken up residence in northern England, and has learned the practice of this shared social activity of so many British people outside urban areas, namely extended walks in the countryside. Indeed, she speaks of the activity as a series of encounters with other walkers, with angry cows, with gentle sheep, with changing weather, with illogically bifurcating paths, not always marked properly, and so forth. It goes without saying that I'm speaking here of walking that is not confined to sidewalks and roads, but to paths and their various avatars, although we all know that Michel de Certeau taught us that even in carefully engineered urban spaces, walkers can ignore the putative rationale of the urban planner and set out on their own. In fact, this is the essence of that wonderful and difficult discipline of parcours, right? Remember that walking paths are paths that have not congealed into roads, and they can become lost, indecipherable, require a lot of meandering to find again. Roads are precisely those throughways which invite us not to meander. And if we rubberneck because something has happened on the side of the road, we immediately provoke a very large traffic jam, right? Because we're not supposed to meander on roads. Here's a passage from The Flesh of Words. I'm quoting Jacques Rancière. The Republican political order, the Republican political is not ordered by the point of view of a privileged spectator, by the spectacle of royal majesty. Those who walk define the Republican political. The community is made up of people who conjure up the same images while walking. Nature has dethroned the king. It is the power that brings into being and holds together people and places where they go to stroll and to look. End of quote. And he draws the following conclusion, I'll quote again. Lyricism is first and foremost a specific mode of enunciation, a way of accompanying what is said, of setting it out in a space of perception, of giving it the rhythm of walking, traveling, passing through. End of quote. Lyricism is a new mode of enunciation that collapses the voice of the literary text onto the voice of the poet, proposing a new resolution to the long-standing Platonic criticism of literature, the confusion about who is speaking in the literary text, character, narrator, poet. The lyric voice is a kind of dwelling provoked by walking, by strolling through a nature where poetic images are strung together. What is at stake, as Rancière argues in The Flesh of Words, is a transformation from the idea of mimesis as the organizing concept of literary production toward the idea of the metaphor as the principal organizing factor. Rancière understands metaphor in both a figurative and a literal sense. I'll quote from him, enunciative accompaniment is thus linked to a problematic of the metaphor as transport. The type of subjectivity that is characteristic of lyric poetry encompasses the movement of a body across a territory in a coincidence of visions and words that constitutes this territory as a space of writing. End of quote. The lyric poet's so-called communing with nature is actually a walk. Metaphor creates relations among heretofore disparate images conjured up by walking. It originates in the movement of the subject poet within a territory where perceiving means dwelling, which can be defined as creating links in the form of metaphors. The as if of mimesis is replaced by the like of metaphor. And the like of metaphor is a different accompaniment, that is, a different way of conceiving the connection between the literary text and the voice of the author. But I think there's more. Nearly 20 years earlier, Rancière's Proletarian Nights described how workers carved out a cultural space in defiance of their capitalist masters who attempted to occupy all their time with work and sleep. Hence, of course, the Nights of the title, but also the idea that the final stage in an apprenticeship, before definitively taking up a trade, could take the form of a walk. A period of travel not defined necessarily by the project of going somewhere. It was instead a period of wayfaring and dwelling, not simply a trip to, but more importantly, a trip in, that is a means of accumulating experiences and of multiplying encounters. The diary written by Claude Genoux, which I can't treat in detail here, but which Rancière elevates into something of a parable later in the Flesh of Words, contains a narrative of a night spent in a humble farmhouse, peasant farmhouse, during which the worker, Genoux, discovers a book, the only one in the entire household. It so fascinates him that when he is unable to persuade the farmer to part with it, he searches in vain to find a copy for years afterwards. Genoux's own diary, in which this incident is recounted, is an exemplary archive of a literary experience no longer tied to Aristotelian mimesis, obviously, but rather to the encounter of a wayfaring apprentice with a worm-eaten volume containing autobiographical and poetical texts written by an unknown author who signs only with his Christian name, Léonard. No Aristotelian high mimetic work. This, rather, an unexpected genre hodgepodge penned by an anonymous writer whose missing family name makes it impossible for Genoux to track down the volume later on. This is a parable of a wayfaring as dwelling of the poet, author, and his eventual reader, which stages the relation between the author's voice and the printed text in the manner that suggests a new way of imagining the connection between voice and writing, leaving, as I said before, the Platonic critique of literature behind. The notion of wayfaring, so central, I think, to Jacques Rancière's approach to democratic literature after the Revolution, suggests, I think, why Joseph Conrad is such an apt example for the philosopher's second chapter on the novel in The Lost Thread. More precisely, his reading of two of the major seafaring novels, Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. It's no secret, of course, that Conrad was a transitional novelist, one of the key writers who pursued the Flaubertian assault on the classical realist novel. Fred Jameson makes the following observation in The Political Unconscious. I quote Fred, "Conrad marks a strategic fault line in the emergence of contemporary narrative." End of quote. Jameson understands what one might call the formal problems of the structure of Lord Jim, namely the juxtaposing of disparate manners of narrating the story, as emblematic of the cultural breakdown of the novel form, a confusion between high culture and mass culture at the heart of Fred's analysis of modernism. One has to wonder if Fred had not read Virginia Woolf's essay on Conrad in The Common Reader before he wrote the sentence I just quoted, because Woolf says something quite comparable, and this is Virginia Woolf. Conrad's reputation of later years was, with one obvious exception, undoubtedly the highest in England. Yet he was not popular. He was read with passionate delight by some, others he left cold and lusterless. End of quote. Moreover, a contemporary critic's review of Lord Jim in the Daily Telegraph eerily, in 1900 actually, eerily replicates the contemporary critiques of Flaubert's novels earlier in the 19th century. The reviewer complains in his article of the, quote, constant wandering from the point, the recurrent introductions of incidents which do not affect the main issue, end of quote. A variation of the problem, the recurring problem in the post-revolutionary novel, as Rancière describes it. Where are the plot threads? Why are they not staked out? Why does the author not hew to them? This reader critic wants to get to the main issue and to leave aside the details, those meanderings that rehash the same events from different perspectives, the general fascination with what one might call atmosphere. Woolf herself says something of the sort as she describes Conrad's style, and I quote from her again. Yet it is arguable that Conrad would have gained both in credit and in popularity if he had written what he had to write without his incessant care for appearances. They block and impede and distract, his critics say. End of quote. Well, I want to suggest actually kind of emblematically that Conrad stages the crisis of the notion of plot in chapter 3 of Lord Jim, that is in the first section of the novel, where a narrator in the classic omniscient mode is in charge of the story. The passage describes the serenity of the ocean's surface during what is an uneventful passage, up to that point, of the vessel on which Jim serves, the Patna. So let me quote from Lord Jim. "Under the sinister splendor of that sky, the sea, blue and profound, remains still, without a stir, without a ripple, without a wrinkle, viscous, stagnant, dead. The Patna, with the slight hiss, passed over the plain, luminous and smooth, unrolled a black ribbon of smoke across the sky, left behind her on the water a white ribbon of foam that vanished at once, like the phantom of a track upon a lifeless sea by the phantom of a steamer." So the ocean is a viscous surface without a ripple upon which the Patna advances, drawing a trace of foam that follows a straight line corresponding to a plot on a shipping map. And that is clearly stated in the novel itself in this passage, and I'll quote, "From time to time, Jim glanced idly at a chart pegged out with 4 drawing pins on a low 3-legged table. The sheet of paper portraying the depths of the sea presented a shiny surface under the light of a bullseye lamp, a surface as level and smooth as the glimmering surface of the waters. The ship's position at last noon was marked with a small black cross, and the straight pencil line drawn firmly as far as Perim figured the course of the ship. How steady she goes, thought Jim with wonder." As readers of the novel know, the featureless surface of the ocean will be rudely disturbed when the ship strikes an object hidden just beneath the surface, that smooth surface that seemed like the surface of the map, and sustains what Jim believes at the time is fatal damage and is going to lead to the sinking of the ship. So a voyage whose itinerary is designated by a geometer's line on a map surface, replicated by the serenity of the surface of the ocean itself, is summarily disrupted. An event shatters the illusion. Travel is transformed into a struggle for survival. The present, as dwelling, rears its unexpected head. And an ocean storm then blows up, and to add insult to injury. So the disturbance in the itinerary is marked in the novel by a change in the narrative form. Instead of describing the accident's aftermath by exploiting the voice of the omniscient narrator who began the story, a new narrator, Marlowe, takes over. The orderly perspective of omniscience gives way to story fragments appearing at different moments through Marlowe's oral storytelling to audiences who are often laboriously digesting, smoking cigars on various verandas after ample meals, and perhaps only listlessly attuned to what Marlowe recounts. And I'll quote from the novel again. And later on, in distant parts of the world, Marlowe showed himself willing to remember Jim, to remember him at length, in detail and audibly, in the deep dusk spectacled by fiery cigar ends. End of quote. As Rancière astutely observes, whereas Flaubert suppresses the narrator, transforming him into a sort of self-effacing voice, refusing commentary on the story he tells, Conrad reintroduces him as a first person in the figure of Marlowe, but as Rancière remarks, and I'm quoting, he has become a mediator whose job is to emphasize to his fictional audience the limit between what can and cannot be transmitted. And we're back to the notion of edge that Jacques Rancière developed yesterday in his talk. And he adds, Rancière again adds, I'll quote again, "How can one give order to all these present instants of light and shadow, each one of which is like a serpent devouring its own tail?" End of quote. So what is always missing in Conrad's 2 Marlowe novels, at least, is a sense of causality of events leading to other events. Instead, Any singular moment can potentially become just another moment offered up by Marlowe's storytelling whenever an attentive audience is constituted. Ultimately, the first-person narrator here is not the one of previous epistolary or autobiographical novel forms, because Marlowe is systematically prevented from offering the last word, either about Jim or about Kurtz earlier in Heart of Darkness, for example. There are some interesting parallels between Rancière's perspective on the narrator and those proposed by Adorno in his own short essay on the narrator, written in the wake of Lukács's reflections on the novel and published in Notes to Literature. When Adorno says of Musil's great novel, The Man Without Qualities, that the narrator, quote, takes a position against representation's falsehood, end of quote, he's echoing in a different register Rancière's argument that post-revolutionary literature turns away from Aristotelian mimesis. Adorno thinks in terms of the reification and alienation provoked by the rise of bourgeois culture, of course, but the essential idea is quite similar. I'll quote from Adorno again. If the novel wants to remain faithful to its realist heritage and to give voice to what truly exists, it must renounce realism. By reproducing the facade, it only makes it complicit with falsehood. End of quote. Representation misleads if it concedes that somehow the parts of the story will construct a whole, be it even a facade. For Adorno, the logic of a type of novelistic writing that refuses any unified construct leads inevitably toward a novel that turns against the narrative function itself. In the aftermath of Flaubert's self-effacing narrator, one of the novel forms real fil rouge, the thread that actually holds together this realist novel, namely the narrator, becomes ultimately a dissipative force, pulling the narrative rope until it is irreparably frayed and undone. The lines anchored by points, which the narrator traditionally staked out as a geometer in presenting the story, waver and begin to meander, undercut the narrator's project of accompanying the story to maintain its outlines. What is left, Adorno suggests, is, and I'll quote from him again, micrological technique in which the unity of the living becomes atomic fragments, end of quote. This is the Marlowe of The Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. As pieces of Jim's story emerge in Lord Jim, for example, the best that Marlowe can do is juxtapose them. And if there is any meaning that emerges, its logic is metaphorical, as Rancière suggests in the case of Romantic poetry. One element is like another element, is like another element, and so on, potentially, endlessly. And here, of course, we encounter the criticism of Conrad's contemporaries, who accused him of drawing out into a novel-length project a story that could have been told as a short story. Yes, if the goal of the experiment had been to construct a plot, of course, that's true. It might be valid. But Conrad's novel was already beyond the pale, beyond the Aristotelian mode, and had moved into the exploratory regions of reading as dwelling and wayfaring, not as traveling to a mapped destination. Seemingly inevitable in such a discussion is the famous meandering line that Trim, Toby's manservant, traces with his walking stick in Volume 9, Chapter 4 of Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy. Trim describes, with a flourish of his cane, an idea that can only be traced with a spatial figure and not expressed in language, namely what it might mean to be celibate and therefore free of the demands of marriage. But also, one might gloss, what it might mean to subvert causal chains by narrative meandering precisely, thereby escaping the snare that might foreclose the dwelling required of the wayfaring reader of the novel. The narrator in Tristram Shandy, that is, in this iconic novel at the very origin of the emerging tradition of the novel, has recourse to the image of a meandering line reproduced on the novel's page, a figure that portrays the free roaming of the novel's threads. The spell cast by the attempt to replicate epic unity in a post-epic world, which led to Balzacian realism, was for Adorno an illusion. He puts it this way: Balzac describes the world with exaggerated precision precisely because it has become foreign, because one cannot touch it with one's finger, and he does so with an acuteness that is the very expression of this loss. End of quote. But while Adorno occasionally seems to mourn the passing of the attempt at unity that was Balzac's quasi-heroic realism, Jacques Rancière embraces its aftermath as the destiny of the form and invites us to understand the richness of reading as dwelling and cheerfully to assume our role as wayfarers. We should sit on the veranda, digest, smoke our cigars, and welcome any Marlowe who might decide to amuse us with an after-dinner tale of some sort. Thank you.